The celebrated author Salman Rushdie is someone who has lived with risk and threat for decades. Back in 1989, he was forced into hiding when one of his novels was accused of being against Islam. His life changed overnight. Over the years, though, it seemed that the threat had receded, that the worst was over. Until in 2022, he was on stage at an event in New York when a man rushed onto that stage and stabbed him multiple times. He was nearly killed that day. But he got back to work, to writing, and he now has a new book out, The 11th Hour, which is a collection of short stories. He's been talking to me about art and life, families and free speech, and the three countries he's called home: India, Britain, and the United States. Here's my conversation with Salman Rushdie for the Mishal Husain Show. Salman Rushdie, welcome.
Thank you.
Your new book is your second published since the awful day on that stage in New York where you came close to losing your life. So I feel I really want to start by asking how you're doing.
I'm okay, thank you. I'm surprisingly okay. I found that doctors inspecting me were constantly telling me that I shouldn't be so well, as if I was doing something wrong. But no, I've made a pretty good recovery.
But it was a hard road. I think
Yes.
that's clear because in your last book, Knife, you write about the life-changing injuries that you've sustained.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of injuries and they were very close to killing me. So the recovery was, it took a long time.
Do you think it changed you that day?
I mean, only in certain ways. I mean, I think if you are given, if you like, an extra lease of life, it makes you see every day as kind of a blessing. Every day is a luxury, and it also gives me the sense of, even more than before, don't waste your time. If you've been given some extra time, use it.
It's interesting to hear you say the word blessing because you're famously not a man of faith.
No, this is an entirely secular blessing.
But psychologically, do you feel it comes back to you, or have you turned the page?
Not anymore. I mean, I think the thing about PTSD is that that's a classic symptom of PTSD, is to replay the event. And I mean, I guess there was a bit of that at the beginning. But I mean, it's been getting on for 3.5 years now, and it's a long, I mean, I think it's long enough to have dealt with it.
As you came round and were conscious of your circumstances again, were you thinking in words on the page?
No, at first I was thinking I don't want to write about it.
Because it was too traumatic?
Yeah, I just thought that's the last thing I want to do. And then I understood that it was impossible for me to write anything else until I'd dealt with it. And I just understood that the only way past it was to go through it. And so then I thought, I better write about it.
So it was a form of therapy then, that book?
Well, it was a form of dealing with it. Yes, I don't like the idea of writing as therapy. I think writing is writing and therapy is therapy.
Yeah.
But it certainly made me feel ownership, like taking charge of it, rather than simply being a victim lying on the ground bleeding. It became my story that I was telling in my way.
Yeah. You have talked, though, about writing as a form of optimism. That it's a positive act and that you hope, it's an act of hope.
Yes, I think all writing is that. I mean, you sit alone in a room for anything, sometimes for years, and you hope that what you produce is going to be valuable to people, or enjoyable to people. But at least people will respond well to it. But you have no idea, And so that requires optimism. I think all writing in that sense is born out of a sort of optimism.
And you have been writing for more than 50 years.
Yeah, it's up there.
Was it a lonely road at first when you're trying to get your first novel published?
Yes.
And then that first novel didn't do as well as you hoped?
To say the least. I mean,
you made up for it later, so I think we can talk about it.
There was, a lot of my contemporaries, like Ian McEwan and Martin Amis and Julian Barnes, they were all taking off like rockets, in their early 20s, producing work which immediately established their voice. And I was stumbling around. And it took me a while to find my direction, you know, and in a way I found it by going back to childhood. And when I started writing what became Midnight's Children, I was really thinking I just want to write a novel about childhood.
But your childhood was in India, and it ended up being a story of India, therefore.
Yeah, and then at some point, the history came pouring in, and it became a much larger scale of book. You know, and it took me like over 5 years to write, because in a way I was learning how to write it while I was writing it.
And the idea that you've lived in these multiple places, you've lived across 3 continents, you've called Britain, India, and now the United States your home. I think all of these themes are present in your work throughout, whether it's fiction or non-fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sometimes I envy those writers who are deeply rooted in one place, you know, and can spend a lifetime drawing on that one place. I mean, William Faulkner, for example, you know, Oxford, Mississippi is a tiny place. And yet it was enough for him to have a lifetime of masterpieces. And that's not been my experience, because I've moved around.
Yeah.
But then, you know, you lose something, you gain something. And I think it's helped me to have a wider vision of the world.
And I think it's there certainly in your latest book, The 11th Hour, which is a collection of short stories, not all of them the same length, some a bit longer. Again, that sense of people and places that have influenced you. One of the ones that interested me is Late, which it's pretty clear is set in the place where you went to university back in the 1960s.
Yes, the university is not named and the college is not named, but it's pretty obvious where it is.
King's College, Cambridge.
Yes.
And why go back to that period?
I'd always wanted to, you know, but I'd never really found the story. And because it was a good time for me. I mean, it was a happy time for me, university, you know, and I'd never written about it. So, and then 2 things happened, sort of squashed together. One was my memory of having briefly encountered the great E.M. Forster, who was in residence at the college. He was an honorary fellow of King's. And he was very nice to me, especially when he found out that I had an Indian background, because India was so important to him.
You meet him in the 1960s, which is what, 40 years after he's published A Passage to India. And he's an academic at Cambridge.
This endless silence. You know, he never wrote another novel after Passage to India.
Yeah. What did he say to you about writing?
Well, he was encouraging. I mean, I very shyly admitted that I was kind of hoping that I would write something. And he was very sweet and generous about it, and said that, you know, he thought that that was good. He thought that a good book about India would probably be written by somebody from India, but with knowledge of Western literature, you know. So, I mean, for a 19-year-old kid, or, you know, it was enormously gratifying to have that kind of benediction.
You fitted the bill.
I fitted his bill, yes, whatever that is. So that was one thing. And the other thing was I mean, I never met Alan Turing, but of course he was another enormously important fellow, you know, person from King's, graduate of King's. And both of them had suffered quite seriously because of their homosexuality. They were both very badly treated and damaged by the fact that it was illegal in England and so on. And so I thought that was something to consider. And so I thought, if I just kind of squash them both into the same character, which will become my character, there'll be a third character who isn't really either of them, then it's a way of talking about all of that.
Yeah, and there's a sort of avenging of the injustices that they went through, which is part of your story.
Yes, it's strangely talked. First of all, I wasn't expecting it to be a ghost story. And secondly, I wasn't expecting it to be a revenge ghost story. And it just grew that way.
Is that the way that you write then? You sit down and you're not sure how the story's going to end?
Well, you have some sense of it, but not a detailed sense. You know, I mean, what I thought it was going to be was a story about an improbable friendship between this elderly gentleman and this young Indian woman student, you know, who had the love of India in common. And I thought it's going to be about this improbable friendship between the two of them. And then when I started writing it, I just found myself typing this sentence in which I killed him in the first sentence. When he woke up that morning, he was dead. And I thought, where did that come from? And then I had to think about it. And then I thought, okay, so it's still going to be about an improbable friendship, but one of the people is dead.
But again, does that mean that you don't do a plan of the story? Or if it's a novel, you don't chart out chapters in advance?
I used to be very architectural about it. You know, I needed to have quite a detailed structure. But as it's gone on, that's kind of changed. I mean, of course, you have some structure. You know, you have to know what you're writing about and why you're writing it. And it goes from here to here, and there are these various points along the way that it needs to touch on. But I more and more see it as a process of discovery. You know, you write the story to find out what story you're writing.
Yeah. And then is there a moment when you know that your instinct has been right? Because you don't have
it's
the plan?
also sometimes wrong. You know, sometimes you go down blind alleys and you have to have the mental toughness to say, no, that's not right. We have to cancel that, go another way.
Does that mean dropping a story entirely? Does that mean they're unfinished fragments? Or do you just redo and you make it right?
You just redo it.
Okay. With an editor or with your own instinct?
No, me. I can't show people unfinished work. So what I mean by finished is when I think I can't make it any better. Then I get very interested in editorial input.
And how do you respond to an editor saying you could make this better this way?
I'm getting much better at it.
But you weren't in the beginning.
I wasn't in the beginning.
So, well, we'll take us back to Midnight's Children then.
Well, there was the most important editorial contributions, both of which I accepted. There was an extra character. You know, in Midnight's Children, Salim is theoretically telling the story to this person who works in the same pickle factory called Padma. And so it's both an oral narrative and a written narrative. And initially, there was a second audience figure. And people at Jonathan Cape, as it was, who read it, all said, you don't need that second figure. You know, you only need one. And so then eventually I agreed to have a go at removing the second figure, and it proved so easy to remove that it was clear that they were right.
But you seem to have struggled with it.
Initially I thought, you know, what are you talking about? And the second thing was there was a moment in the sort of about 2/3 of the way through the novel where the timeline got a bit scrambled, where I jumped forward and then back and then forward again. And basically, Liz Calder, who was my editor, said, just, you know, keep the chronology, you know, tell it in sequence. And again, she was right. So I did that. So I did even then accept very important pieces of editorial contribution.
Yeah. And that was the book that was life-changing for you, that made you famous overnight when you won the Booker Prize for it in 1981. I still want to go back in time, though, because saying while you were still at university to E.M. Forster that you wanted to be a writer, I know a bit about the kind of family environment you would have grown up in, even though we're a generation apart. Yeah. There's a connection between us. I might as well spell it out now. Your mother and my grandmother were sisters.
Yes, and your mother was my first cousin.
With whom you spent time in your growing up years when you both spent time in the same family house.
Yes.
Your grandparents' house. But the reason I'm interested in the writing side of it is that from what I know of that environment, wasn't there an emphasis on being a professional of a different kind, a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer?
Yes, my father was not pleased when I said I wanted to write books. But I remember what he said. He said, what will I tell my friends? And fortunately, he lived long enough for his friends to call him up and congratulate him.
But that's not because he, you know, these are literate people who enjoy consuming writing, but it's a question of how you're going to support yourself.
Yeah, I mean, writing's not a real job, you know, it's a hobby.
So what gave you the courage to think, no, I'm really going to have a go at this?
I guess I really wanted to do it, you know. I think if I look back at that young fellow, he had real determination, because it took me a long time. You know, I mean, I graduated from Cambridge in 1968, and Midnight Children came out in 1981. So that was almost 13 years of not getting there before I did get there. And I think that determination, you know, retrospectively, I'm quite proud of it.
Yeah. It's either a short time or a long time, depending on the way you look at it. It's a relatively short time for the success you've had subsequently.
Well, but everybody else was doing much better than me. So.
And you were conscious of that, competitive?
Well, I mean, you know, you're aware of what your generation is doing, I think.
Yeah. And then, again, to the environment that shaped you in India, as you're growing up in Bombay in the 1950s, I know your father read you stories, but your mother, my great aunt, who I remember very well, I feel that she and her sisters were also part of an unusual generation where for women of their time, they were thinking about careers, they were not going to be in parda, they were not going to live the same way their mother did.
No, they were very open-minded, you know, and brought us up in that way. You know, we were brought up in a very, what I suppose you would call liberal atmosphere, and very largely secular atmosphere. You know, it wasn't an enormous amount of religion in our house.
Mm. And that was a tone that was then set for the rest of your life. Did it give you a certain freedom? Yeah, because we didn't, I mean, you know, maybe my father would take me to Eid prayers once a year. That was about it. Mm. And I didn't understand them. Of course, I don't speak any Arabic. I'd just go up and down when he went up and down, and that was what he instructed me to do. Yeah. But Urdu was your mother tongue?
Yes.
Actually, as it was mine as well, because I was also spoken to only in Urdu in the first few years of my life. Is it still present in your life in some way?
Yeah, I still speak Urdu, yes. And I mean, what would happen in childhood was that, I mean, I went to a school which was an English medium school in Bombay, the Cathedral School. So at school we would speak English, but when we got home, my mother would tend to speak to us in Urdu. So we were brought up in that way.
Mm. And what was the influence of your grandparents' home, which I tried to track down in northern India some years ago, but it had already been pulled down by then?
It's been demolished, yeah. But well, in Aligarh, which is this university town south of Delhi, they had this rather beautiful old-style Indian courtyard house, and like a couple of times a year there would be like family gatherings where, you know, my mother, her two sisters, her two brothers, and their children would all gather at the grandparents' house. And we would, I mean, I can remember we would perform little plays. Children would perform little plays for the entertainment of the adults. And we would all sleep on the roof, on charpai beds under mosquito nets. And it was kind of rather magical, that house. Mm. And it was where because, you know, some of the family was in Pakistan and some was in India. So that house became the place where we came together.
Yeah, and I think also because one of your uncles was in films and his wife was an actor and a dancer, this sort of sense of culture and performance and art of different kinds is part of your life.
Yes, well, my uncle Hamid, who also lived in Bombay as we did, had this apartment on Marine Drive, which I remember with great affection because he was like my favorite uncle. I mean, he was very booming and funny and affectionate, and his wife was rather wonderful too. And so I remember my visits to this apartment with great pleasure.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this because I've only ever, you know, I know that this environment is part of what shaped, you know, my mother as well, but I've always heard about it secondhand. When you set out to write Midnight's Children, I know you, by that stage, you hadn't been to Bombay or to India for a long time. So I think you...
But I went back.
Before. Mm. But you spent a lot of time trying to remember as well the fragments of...
Yes, I mean, I think memory is a great resource, you know. I mean, when you seriously try and remember, it's amazing how much comes back. But no, I did. After I've published my unsuccessful first novel, I took what little money I'd earned from it and went to India for many months, living and traveling as cheaply as I could in order to kind of get it back in my system, you know. And
making notes?
Making notes. And that included, of course, Bombay, but also some parts that I'd never been to, like Benares, for example, which I had in my mind some crude structure of what would become Midnight's Children. And I wanted to go to places that I thought might get into the book. And
you stood outside your old childhood home, I think.
Yes, and went inside because we actually, I actually knew the people to whom my parents had sold the house. So they welcomed us in, and the interior had been completely transformed. It looked like a Bollywood movie set. But the house was still the house.
And what were you setting out to tell a big story of
No,
India?
as I say, it got larger. It started out I thought I'd just got to write a novel about childhood.
Yeah.
And then, because, I'm, 8 weeks older than the independent nations of India and Pakistan. And at some point it occurred to me, supposing it wasn't an 8-week difference, supposing it was the same time, where did that take you? And of course, where it took you into was to have the subject of the history of the independent nations being a part of the story.
Yeah.
So it became a much, much bigger book.
And of course, the family is deeply, your own family is deeply affected by this, our family, because I realized as I put the chronology together in my head that, your mother with you as a newborn is in Bombay and her two sisters are sort of trying to get from Simla to Delhi and eventually to Pakistan. So you're born at a time of tremendous rupture of different kinds.
Yes, I mean, and like many Indian Muslim families, the family was more or less cut in half. So my mother and my Uncle Hamid and my Uncle Mahmud all stayed in India. And my mother's two sisters, were in Pakistan.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when we were little children, and there were moments when it was easier to travel between India and Pakistan than it is now. There used to be these little boats that went from Bombay to Karachi. Real sort of not very grand boats, called Sabarmati and Saraswati. And you used to be able to take the boat, because actually Bombay to Karachi is not very far, as the crow flies. It's like a day and a night on a tin pot boat. And so we would go every so often, more to Karachi than to where your family was in Rawalpindi. But so there was more interchange between India and Pakistan at that time.
Was India then the home of your childhood, the country of your childhood, effectively then taken away from you when your parents moved to Pakistan in the 60s?
Yeah, I mean, I was very cross with them for selling the house in Bombay.
Why did they leave India?
I'd never understood it. I mean, they said, amongst other things, that they wanted their daughters to have Muslim husbands, which was very odd given how lacking in religious faith, particularly my father had always been. So I never really got to the bottom of it. And I don't think they were that content after moving to Karachi, because they had a very nice life in Bombay, it puzzles me that they left. And I felt I had to get it back. There was a point after leaving Cambridge and deciding to base myself in London to try and be a writer, that I felt that I was in danger of losing touch. And that's why I went on that long journey of several months. And that led to Midnight Children. And that I felt, I always told myself that Bombay is a city, a lot of it is built on land reclaimed from the sea. The British had a big land reclamation project where they joined up the 7 islands into one peninsula. And I thought, I'm also engaged in an act of land reclamation. And that's what that book was.
Did it give you what you were looking for?
It did, really, yeah. Yeah, because it's the reception of Midnight Children in India was wonderful. And it gave me a feeling of, belonging again.
You did make political points through it. It was at the end of the period of the emergency that Indira Gandhi had brought about. And were you were intending it as a critique of India at that time?
As I say, if you're writing a book in which the character and the country are kind of twins, you have to write about both the twins. And the emergency was a real shock to many of us. The fact that the so-called world's largest democracy would flirt with dictatorship. I mean, more than flirt, actually. For a couple of years, it was quite serious. And so it had to get into the book. And I mean, actually, I was very worried because I didn't want the book to end on that note. I can't end the emergency in my book if it hasn't ended in real life. And then Indira Gandhi called an election and lost. And I felt really grateful to her because she gave me the end of the book. You know.
Do you think that, as you look back now, as you look at India today, is Indira Gandhi a more benign figure than you thought she was at the time?
Well, not during the years of the emergency. I think that was a very dark time, which is not unlike what's happening now in its way. But I mean, she was a more impressive figure, I think. You know, and of course, Kay had an important comeback. You know, she regained power after some years. So, no, I mean, she's an extraordinary woman. You know, and I remember, you know, as I say, when Midnight Children came out, it was very well received. If there was any criticism of it, some people felt that the ending was too pessimistic. And now, looking back at it, I think the ending was absurdly optimistic.
Compared to what's happened since?
Compared to what's actually happened since then.
So how do you feel about India today under Prime Minister Modi? I
feel very worried about it, you know, because, I mean, I have a lot of friends in India who are journalists and who from whom I get interesting information about what's going on. And I think everybody is extremely concerned with the attack on freedoms of journalists, of writers, of intellectuals, of professors, you know, etc. There is even beyond that, there seems to be a desire to rewrite the history of the country. Essentially to say Hindus good, Muslims bad. And the thing that V.S. Naipaul once called a wounded civilization, the idea that India is a Hindu civilization wounded by the arrival of Muslims.
Invaders.
That project has a lot of energy behind it.
There's a lot of press. I was looking at this book, Imaginary Homelands, which is your criticism and essays written through the 1980s and first published in 1991. And you do warn about a lot of things that have become more extreme ever since.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you're, as a writer, if you're paying attention, then sometimes you see things coming, you know, and I think that's what I was doing. I was paying attention.
What about the people in your life? Because I know that obviously Midnight's Children is a work of fiction, but you draw on the structure of your of your true family.
Yes, my father was very annoyed.
He was not the only one. I think others closer to me were pretty upset or felt you'd been unfair. And
my mother was very, very calm about it. She said, "Oh yes, I can see this, what's happening here, but this is not me, and this is not my husband, and it's all made up." So actually, my mother had a very good literary response to it, and other people in the family not so much.
Did you mind that, or were you, because you're also basking in the massive adulation that you had in that period?
Yes, of course I minded it. There's a famous sentence by the Nobel laureate Czeslaw Milosz, who said, when a writer enters the family is screwed.
And that was you.
And that was me.
Bombay is there in the 11th Hour as well, particularly in the story, The Musician of Kahani, The Musician of Stories. And there's a part in it where you do the writer's version of Breaking the Fourth Wall, where you talk about your own childhood home, and there's an allusion as well to the main character in Midnight's Children.
Yes, he makes a little guest appearance.
So tell me what's going on, what leads to that? Is it a flight of fancy at the time you're writing?
No, what I thought, one of the things about that story is that it felt to me like a kind of farewell from me to a neighborhood which has been very important in my writing. You know, it's not only Midnight's Children, actually. In my novel Quixote, one of the major characters has a backstory in the same neighborhood.
Is it bigger than a farewell to the neighborhood that you grew up in? Is it more like a farewell to India?
I don't know the answer to that. You know, I mean, I'm very reluctant to predict what I'm going to write in the future, because every time I've ever done it, I've been wrong. You know, if I say, "Oh, I'm never going to write about India again," that you might find a 600-page novel about India following. So I don't know, but it felt like a conclusion of a certain concern, and I liked it that I found a story which wasn't about me to tell, but to tell it as a way of saying that's enough from that place.
I meant more in real life. Can you visit? Do you want to visit?
Oh yeah, I mean, I hope to go. I haven't been since before the pandemic. There was the pandemic and then there was the attack, and that's slowed things down. But yeah, I'm hoping to go.
And do you feel you can visit safely?
We'll find out.
Of course, the first time your life, everything about your daily life changed significantly with your writing was after the Satanic Verses in 1989. And when you wrote your memoir of that time, you wrote it in the third person as if what's happening is happening to someone else.
Yes.
Was that a conscious effort to distance yourself?
Well, what I felt was that by the time I got round to writing it, it was quite a few years after the events that are described in the book. And what I felt was that the person writing the book and the person about whom the book was written were in slightly different places in their lives. The person about whom the book was being written was, under great stress and was in all kinds of personal and political difficulty. And the person writing the book was in a better place, And so I just thought that it's not, although they're both me, they're not quite the same me. And so that was one of the reasons for the third person. And the other was I wanted the book to read like a novel.
Which was your forte.
Yeah, and I think if you're writing a memoir or an autobiography, the character called I has a kind of significance that the other characters don't. And I thought if I take away the I, and if I refer to the me character in the same language as all the other characters, that it brings that character down to the same level as the other characters, and then it reads like a novel. So those were the reasons. But then by the time I got round to writing Knife, that felt very personal. I felt that had to be a first-person book.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that so after the time of the fatwa and the fact that your life changes overnight when you have to go into hiding and you're under British police protection, that you're still writing, but you're continuing to write fiction. You're not writing about your real life circumstances.
No, but I was keeping a journal, which I have not in my life been a journalist, a journal keeper. Unlike some writers I know who are very detailed journal keepers. But just in those years, I thought that these events were so powerful and things moved so rapidly, there was so much going on, that I thought there's no way I'm going to remember this. I'm not going to remember like the dailiness of it. And so I need to keep a record. So I did have, hundreds and hundreds of pages of journal that I kept for that almost a decade.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the decade before the fatwa, your non-fiction is a lot about India and Pakistan and about race relations and so much of what you're seeing around you, which you're doing alongside your fiction. And then, of course, after the fatwa, you've become much more associated with the cause of free speech because of the price that you've paid for yours.
Yeah, I think that's right.
How do you feel about, when you look around with free speech, how do you feel about it today? Yeah. Well, is it even more challenged, or is the right to it even more challenged than it was in 1989 when the fatwa was put on you?
I think there's unexpected amounts of pressure on free expression and on people to restrain themselves from certain kinds of speech and so on. And the pressure comes, I think, historically, the pressure on free speech comes from conservative forces in society who disapprove of less conservative voices. But now it comes from the other end as well. There are people who are willing to, as they say, deplatform voices that they don't like. Whereas my kind of old school view is that the defense of free speech begins when somebody says something you don't like. Because it's actually perfectly easy to defend people who you agree with or to whom you're indifferent.
Exactly, that is in such short supply now.
Yes.
Most people who are defenders of free speech just really want their own speech defended.
Exactly, and that's the opposite of free speech. Over the years, I've been involved in quite a lot of free speech issues, and very often you find yourself defending things you don't like at all.
But do you have to be careful then not to be co-opted too much when you realize that some of the people who want you to rally behind them are actually only interested in one kind of free speech?
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, it's the battle is not easy. It's a complicated battle, and you have to be on your guard. But the general principle, I think, has to be that if there's a pressure to censor something, the censor has to make the case. The default setting has to be
the freedom.
And different countries set the limit in different places. So for example, here, in the UK, because of the Race Relations Act, there are certain kinds of speech which are forbidden, racist speech. Whereas in America, because of the First Amendment, much of the speech that would be forbidden under the Race Relations Act is permitted. So different countries draw there are European countries which outlaw Holocaust denial. And there are other countries which think that that's a mistake.
But the US, which is your home now, do you see a different climate on free speech even there?
Yeah, I mean, the writers' organization PEN America, a few weeks ago, issued a report in which it said that at this moment in the United States, there are 23,000 active book bans. And in many cases in schools, one parent objecting to the presence of a book on the syllabus or in the library can result in having that book removed. 23,000. And these are not just any old books. These are Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Huckleberry Finn, or To Kill a Mockingbird. Some of the best books ever written. And there is a fight back against it, because there is the defense of the First Amendment. And so there's a lot of court cases. And in many cases, those court cases are succeeding, but there's just a lot to fight about. There have been a series of elections to school boards across America. And in every single case, the book banners have been swept off the board, and more liberal people have come on it. So there is a backlash against the book bans, and hopefully that will prevail.
But the fact that they have come in at all, could you ever have imagined that in the US? Because you've made the country your home for 25 years, I think?
26 now, yeah. But no, I would never have imagined it, because one of the reasons why people like me wanted to live in America is because of the fact that free speech is enshrined in the Constitution. I mean, the First Amendment is very powerful. And in a country of that kind, that this should happen. And especially what you begin to notice is that many of the books that are being banned have something in common, which is that they deal with America seen from the perspective of people who are not white. If you think about Beloved or To Kill a Mockingbird, I mean, books like that's what they have in common, that they tell the story of America from a different viewpoint. And there is, in my view, clearly an attempt again to erase that viewpoint. And so it's more important than just the fact that this or that title that you happen to be fond of is banned. It's a question of what would happen to a generation of children if they grow up ignorant of the history of the country. That's dangerous.
And what dangerous?
Dangerous because it is a very plural society, a very diverse society, and if all you hear is one version, which is the version of the dominant race, then that's potentially very destabilizing.
It is New York, which you've made your home, and New York now has a new mayor-elect, who I think you must know because you've worked with his mother, Mira Nair.
Well, I haven't worked with Mira, but I've known her a long time. Yes, yes.
But the film of Midnight's Children was hers?
No, it was Deepa Mehta.
Ah. I thought Mira has she not collaborated with you?
No, Deepa and Mira have this joke that they're always being congratulated on each other's films.
Okay, don't tell them I said this. But you know Mira Nair?
I know Mira, yes. I don't know his father so well, but I've met Mahmoud as well. And, I mean, look, he ran a terrific campaign. He energized young people especially. Normally in a New York mayoral election, the percentage of people voting is not that high. It's a very Democrat city. The Democrat always wins, except Giuliani. So normally it's kind of boring. But this was a very energized race. I think it was the highest percentage of turnout since about the 1960s. So he certainly earned it.
Do you think Zohran Mamdani's success is replicable outside New York City?
I don't know. I mean, I think maybe in certain parts of the country, but New York is a very particular place. I mean, I thought what was interesting on the day that he won the election to be mayor was that in two other places, in New Jersey and Virginia, women, Democrat women, much more centrist than Mamdani, also won by very large margins, much larger margins than were expected. I mean, double-digit margins. And so I thought it's unclear which is the better direction to follow, and maybe you don't have to follow one direction everywhere.
Zohran Mamdani did not resile from his support for Palestinian rights, which became an issue for some in that campaign. Tell me how you feel about that particular cause today, because in Imaginary Homelands there's a long conversation that you had with Edward Said, who you obviously knew in his lifetime.
Edward was a good friend. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I still have the view that the two-state solution is the solution, but the question is whether anybody there believes in that anymore. I think neither Netanyahu nor Hamas were that interested in a two-state solution.
But Hamas is not all the Palestinian people.
No, it's not. And the question is, how do we get out of this dreadful situation and move towards something that has some kind of justice in it? And I don't know the answer to that, because the Palestinian Authority isn't supported by a lot of Palestinians. Hamas, I think, has perhaps lost support amongst a lot of Palestinians. So, I mean, who do you negotiate with? And who does the negotiating?
And back to the free speech side, in this country, in the UK, today you can't hold up a sign saying I support Palestine action without being arrested. What do you think of making that essentially making it a terrorist group? I
think that's probably a mistake. I mean, my view has always been let voices be heard. Even if as I say, more or less, especially if I disagree with them. Because I was saying it's no trick to allow somebody to hold up a placard that you agree with. And I mean, I was surprised the last time I was in England, which was some months ago now. There was this huge demonstration in London of 150,000 people marching against immigration.
The Unite the Kingdom rally.
Yeah, and I thought I couldn't believe that was happening in England. So I think there is a destabilization here as well as in America. So it's a very worrying time.
Well, how does that leave you feeling? Because we've talked about India, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Similar things happening everywhere.
Disquieted by what's happening in all three countries.
Yeah, I mean, this book, which deals with all three countries. I mean, writing it, I was aware of the fact that there were echoes they're not exactly the same situation. They all have their local differences, but there are echoes between all three societies of what's going on, and I mean, not to my liking. Sometimes the world moves in a direction that's not to your liking, and all you can do is hope that it'll change. And I mean, in America, there are some small indications that it'll change. I mean, as I was saying, that in the various votes that there have been recently, there's been an enormous swing away from what one might call Trumpism.
And then you yourself, with a book tour for your most recent book, what comes next? Are you writing again, or will you take a breath before your next?
No, I'm always happier when I'm writing than when I'm not. If you ask anybody who knows me, I'm much better company when I have a book to write. I would hope that the next thing will be a novel. And I have a germ of something that I've started work on, but I really don't know where it's going yet. I think I know what it's about, but I don't know how to do it yet.
Does that mean you haven't yet sat down with the empty laptop screen
in
front of you?
I've got some stuff. I've got some pages, but I'm not sure about them.
And what is your routine like? Are you disciplined? Is it like, this is my writing time and this is my personal time?
Actually, what's happened to me over this, as you say, this half century, is that I've become very disciplined, and now I do it like a job. And I'm not one of those writers who can get up at dawn and work. I'm not very good early in the morning. So I get up in the morning at a sort of ordinary time, and I have my coffee and I go to work. And I do a day's work. And I am very disciplined now, I think. There's a funny line of when Hemingway was once asked about literary commitment, by which the interviewer meant political commitment. And Hemingway said the only commitment a writer needs is the commitment of the seat of his pants to the seat of his chair. And I think that's very important, sitting down. You can't. There are writers who work standing up, but mostly you sit down.
But is any of that more difficult because you have had life-changing injuries? You've lost the sight in one eye. I know you have problems with the other one, and your hand, your neck were damaged in the attack.
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm clumsier. I make more typing mistakes, etc. Everything is a bit harder, but writing is hard anyway. So it's just a different problem.
And how do you cope with the solitude required? The locking yourself away to work, is it?
Well, I've got a very nice room to work in, and I shut the door.
And come out when you've got to a certain number of words.
And yes, I always give myself an artificially low number of words. That's the cheat.
So that you can exceed it.
Yes, exactly.
So what is the daily total then?
Well, if I could get a couple of 100 words done, I would think that's not bad. A page is usually 300 and a bit, 320, something like that. If I can do that, I'm extremely pleased. But Flaubert used to come down from his study and say he'd had a great day today. He wrote a sentence. So writing is sometimes slow, sometimes quick. With these books, the Knife and the 11th Hour, I was quite surprised by how fluently they came out. That they neither of them took. They came out at 1 year intervals. And for me, that's some kind of a record. There's quite often I've taken 5 years to write a book. So it seems I'm getting faster in my old age.
Salman Rushdie, good luck with the next one.
Thank you.